Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. I just wanted to take a few minutes. This isn't necessarily a shareholder update. This is more specific to answering common questions I get almost daily. We always get to the point of extraction and extraction methods. So to kind of dispel some of the rumors and just help people understand a little bit of what the different options are, I'm gonna run down those really quickly. This isn't meant to be a tutorial on how to make CBD isolate or THC isolate, although we'll touch on those processes a little bit. It's meant to just cover the big three. I'm gonna fire fast and furious, so stick with me. If you're an investor that's just here to talk about the business plan and the projects we're on, there'll be other videos for that. This is increasing people's knowledge base and, quite frankly, freeing up some of my free time so I'm not answering the same 30 questions every month. I'm going to talk about the big three. CO2 extraction, which is a gas, but it kind of fits into its own category. Hydrocarbons, methane, heptane, hexane, butane, and propane being the most popular. That'd be BHO and PHO. I'm sure most of you heard those terms at some point or another. And then the last being ethanol, which is an alcohol extraction. If we kind of fire down the list of those three options, CO2 is the most popular. It's by far the most expensive, and it's what most large-scale operations or people that have intentions of scaling are focused on. And that's because of the automation, the simplicity of the machinery once it's set up, and that comes from automation. The limited requirements on the room, it's effectively a CO2 monitor and appropriate signage, and it's relatively fast. So there are machines now that are doing continuous feed, like Precision Extractions are doing these mega machines that can do 6,000 pounds a day of raw material, and it's just this continual feed of flow. It's one of the most exciting versions of extraction because it allows for cold extraction. So we call that selective or tunable extraction. You can focus on a specific terpene. There's over 100 terpenes, or kind of think of them as essential oils inside of the cannabis plant. And this allows us to target certain terpenes and extract them on their own. So it's really compelling for making custom blends and not just burning through all of that when you're doing an extraction. So they're tunable, and that's one of the key benefits. One of the other main factors is that it's relatively safe and there are no residual solvents. So it's a closed loop system. The CO2 is reintroduced back into the chamber, and you've got a product at the end that is relatively clean because there are no residual solvents. The cons are mostly cost. The floor is about $100,000 and it goes up fast and furiously from there. So that's something to consider. It's one of the biggest expenses when you're building out a processing facility. One of the other cons is that there are cheaper machines, but they're manual, and it requires a really detailed understanding of how the machinery works, and that makes it really, really tough to scale. So I think I'll kind of leave it at that. CO2 is kind of the big dog in the room. It's the one that's got the most technology involved, and I think it's kind of the future of the industry for large scale production, but it does have some drawbacks. The yield of the product typically does not have the same levels of THC that you would find in a product that's using a hydrocarbon. So let's move to hydrocarbons from there. So let's move now, we're talking about gases and fuels. It introduces an obvious risk, right? It's not just flammable, it's also explosive. So the rooms require a Division I, Class I build out, which is far more expensive, brings in a lot more oversight and regulation. And in my experience, those are the facilities that most of the regulators target. So it makes life a little more difficult as far as an operator. And of course, the initial cost is much higher. So although the equipment and supplies, they pale in comparison to the cost of a CO2 machine, the required build out of the facility having spark-proof outlets, grounding mat, all of the equipment and supplies that are required to meet those standards, that's one of the kind of 6 of one or half a dozen of the other. But most of the equipment involved is actually fairly crude when it comes to blasting using hydrocarbons. The main benefit is the THC levels are very, very high. It's not tunable, so you don't get to select these essential oils. So a lot of times the essential oils are reintroduced either from other products or from other runs to introduce terpenes back into the finished product. But it's extremely high THC, and it's really, really popular amongst kind of what I consider like the dab heads, and the culture of cannabis is big on dabs and crumble and wax and things. And most of these are a derivative of butane and propane extractions. So that's something to consider as well. There's a lot of companies in Washington that have their CO2 machines parked because the market really demands higher THC concentrations than their their CO2 machines are putting out. So that's something to consider. The finished product on hydrocarbons isn't as applicable towards vape pens like a CO2 product is. So just something to consider as we talk about these different types of extraction. You want to think about the products you intend to make, and that will more likely than not dictate which type of processing makes the most sense for you. So the last highlight of hydrocarbons is the speed. It's extremely fast. So the turnaround time and the scalability of it is it's not limitless, but it's something that is very easy to scale. Again, the build out on the con side, very expensive. You've got explosive products. You're going to want somebody that's a bit of a lab tech involved with this. You don't want to hire a minimum wage employee to sit around and monitor your hydrocarbon extractions. It requires more attention to detail than that. You can't target the specific terpenes like we talked about earlier. And the last one, which isn't a big deal for most people, but if you're in an area that restricts the amount of hydrocarbon you can have on site, say you're limited to 150 pounds, that affects your scalability. So that's something to consider as well. If you're scaling to a mass market or you're in California, the likelihood that a single facility with only 150 pounds of hydrocarbon on site is going to be able to keep up with the production demands is limited. But if you have that problem, I also think that's a good problem to have. So those are just some of the limiting factors to consider. Again, nothing's perfect. They all have a place in the industry. It's identifying which one works best for you or your organization. So kind of moving on to the ethanol extraction, that's alcohol. It's my favorite. I love the finished product. It comes out in an oil form. It's really great for making products that are going to eventually turn into distillate. You also end up with kind of a very nimble product. It has to be refined after the process. So you will have some residual solvent. You will have what's kind of considered a winterization process. So you'll kind of cook off some of the alcohol to make sure you've got a finished product. But the advantages are the equipment is very inexpensive, which makes it fairly scalable. Some would argue that it's not a very scalable process because it's not very fast, but when the equipment is as cheap as it is, then one person can usually manage and monitor multiple units at a time. So this is not a difficult process. It's a little slower, but again, the cost is low. The facilities are less expensive to build out. There's lower requirements, although I'd still urge people to follow the more restrictive policies around the hydrocarbons because you're still dealing with a highly flammable chemical. We still use hoods and we try to limit anything that could spark around the product, but that's just good common lab practices. For these facilities that are, we touched on power a little bit, these require very little power. So if you're a remote facility, particularly like a greenhouse grow that's got a processing center that's trying to quickly process finished material, these are a good option as well because there's not much taxation on your power demands. So power is an issue for most of these facilities, especially if you're remote. So consider the low power draw of the ethanol extraction to be a major advantage, particularly in the rural processing centers. So the cons of ethanol, there are a few. One, you can't stop chlorophyll from being pulled through. So if you aren't using keef or some other form of extraction and you're just doing raw plant material, you're going to pull some chlorophyll in, which can have an undesired effect on the finished product. So you've got to figure out what you intend to make with this product and whether or not you're going to have to further refine it. Now, I would argue there are processes you can do and introduce into these steps that will eliminate a lot of that. But again, this comes down to finished products and what you intend to make. We already touched on this as a con a little bit, but you do have to refine the material afterwards, which sometimes means just heating up for a short period of time, but it depends again on what you intend to make. Last but not least, we touched on this. It's flammable. It's still highly flammable, 100% alcohol. So it's something that requires, general lab practices and somebody that knows what they're doing. So I think you can gather from this that there is no perfect solution for each and everything. And I think a lot of you who are looking to do CBD are going to find themselves looking at slightly different machinery. But if your goal is to have an isolate product, then you're going to introduce an absorbent, which is effectively sand. So you'll be running your finished material through a pressurized tube that has a sand-like material in it that under pressure is going to force the molecules to separate, and the CBD will actually come out of the chamber before THC. And so through a series of runs, you will continually separate the targeted molecules that you're after, and then you can refine the finished product down to a isolate form, which will give you kind of a powder or or a crystal, depending on how well you've refined it in the end or what refinement process you're using. So kind of that last part about the absorption chamber is, that's probably way too crude of an explanation as to how you get there, but I'm not trying to train you guys how to be lab experts. I just want you to understand the processes. So in my opinion, I love the ethanol extraction because of the finished form. I think it's really nimble. It can turn into a lot of different products and be refined a number of different ways, and it's very inexpensive, so it makes it really scalable. It's what I encourage most people to start with and then build from there as they figure out what their product SKU mix is going to be and what their margins are. So hopefully you learned a little something from this, and for those of you that are looking for more specific information about the company, those videos will be listed in other categories, but we're going to chalk this up as the tutorial section. By spending an hour or two putting this video together, I probably save myself 4 to 6 hours a month in explanations that I'm giving to new clients or partners that are coming to the table with us. So I appreciate the time. Hope everyone is having a great week, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks.